My name is Joshua Farrell. I'm 32 years old, and I live with my 6-year-old daughter, Irene, in a modest 2-bedroom house on Maple Street in Oakwood. It's not much: faded blue siding, a creaky porch, a kitchen faucet that drips no matter how many washes I replace. But it's ours. And after losing my wife 3 years ago, that counts for everything. I work remotely as a computer programmer for White Limited, one of those mid-sized tech companies nobody's heard of, but which keeps bigger companies running. I write code, debug systems, and attend video meetings where half the room has their cameras off. It's not glamorous, but it pays the bills and lets me be there when Irene gets home from school. Most nights are the same. Irene goes to bed around 8:30. I brew coffee, settle at my desk, and work until past midnight. The glow of my monitor the only light in the house. It was 2 a.m. on a Tuesday in late October when 3 sharp knocks shattered that routine. I froze. Nobody knocks at 2 a.m. with good news. I walked to the door and flipped on the porch light. Through the peephole, I saw the last person I ever expected, Susan G. White, CEO of White Limited, my boss, but not the composed executive from company calls. This woman had mascara streaking down her rain-soaked face, her expensive coat drenched, her hair plastered to her head. Clutched in her hand was a small boy, maybe 7, looking terrified. I opened the door. Her voice cracked. "Joshua, my husband and my sister betrayed me. I have nowhere else to go. No one else I can trust." She swallowed hard. "Can we stay here? Just one night, please? Before we continue, please tell us where in the world you are tuning in from. We love seeing how far our stories travel." I let Susan and her son into my house that night. They were both soaking wet from rain. Susan looked nothing like the powerful CEO I knew from work. She looked broken. Her son, Daniel, was 7 years old and clearly scared by everything that was happening. I gave them towels and made tea while they sat in my living room. Daniel fell asleep quickly on the couch. Then Susan told me everything that had happened to her that night. Susan had been on a business trip to New York. She went there twice a month to meet with clients and investors. She was supposed to stay until Thursday, but one of her biggest meetings got canceled at the last minute. The client had a family emergency and had to reschedule. Susan decided this was a perfect opportunity to go home early and surprise her husband, Scott. Scott was a real estate developer. He owned a company that built luxury condos and office buildings around Seattle. Susan had actually met him at a business conference 10 years ago. They got married after dating for 2 years. For the first few years, their marriage was a happy one. Then Susan's company started growing fast, and she had to travel more. Scott said he understood, but Susan admitted she knew things had been tense between them for the past year. When Susan got to their mansion in the expensive Bellevue neighborhood, it was almost 10 at night. She parked her car in the driveway and noticed her sister Michelle's car was there too. Susan thought maybe Michelle had stopped by to visit Scott, which wasn't unusual. Michelle worked in the marketing department at White Limited, a job Susan had given her 3 years ago. The sisters had always been close. Susan walked into her house quietly because she thought Scott might be asleep. She went upstairs to the master bedroom. The door was slightly open. That's when she heard voices. Scott's voice and Michelle's voice. They were laughing. Susan pushed the door open and found her husband and her sister in bed together. Susan said the moment felt like time stopped. She couldn't breathe. She couldn't think. Scott jumped out of bed and started making excuses, but they sounded hollow. He said the marriage had been dead for months. He said Susan cared more about her company than about him. Michelle just sat there in the bed and didn't even look sorry. Then Michelle said something that made everything worse. She told Susan that this affair had been going on for 6 months. 6 months of sneaking around behind Susan's back. 6 months of betrayal. Michelle even said she was in love with Scott, and they were planning to move in together. Susan grabbed Daniel from his room. The poor boy was already asleep and got woken up by all the shouting. Susan packed a bag as fast as she could and left the mansion. She didn't know where to go, so she just drove around Seattle in the rain. She thought about going to a hotel, but she knew the media would find out. Susan was a public figure in the Seattle business community. If word got out that she was staying in a hotel alone with her son, reporters would start asking questions. By morning, the story of her husband's affair would be everywhere. She thought about calling her parents, but they lived in Florida, and it was the middle of the night. Her father had a heart condition, and Susan didn't want to worry him with this news over the phone. She thought about her friends, but most of them were wives of Scott's business partners. She knew some of them would gossip. Some might even take Scott's side because their husbands did business with him. That's when Susan thought of me. She remembered that I was a single father who worked from home. She knew from company records that I lived in Oakwood, a small, quiet town about 40 minutes from Seattle. She knew I kept to myself and didn't gossip with other employees. Most importantly, she remembered reading in my employee file that I had lost my wife 3 years ago. She thought maybe I would understand what it felt like when your whole world fell apart. So Susan drove to Oakwood. She found my address in the company database. She parked outside my house and sat in her car for 20 minutes, wondering if she was making a mistake. Then she decided she had no other choice. She took Daniel's hand and walked up to my door and knocked. I told Susan she could stay as long as she needed. I gave Daniel blankets and pillows and set him up on my couch. The poor kid fell asleep within minutes. I offered Susan my bedroom and said I would sleep on the floor in Irene's room. Susan tried to argue and said she couldn't take my bed, but I insisted. She was too tired to fight about it. She went into my room and closed the door. I lay down on the floor next to Irene's bed that night. Irene was fast asleep and didn't know anything strange was happening. I stared at the ceiling and couldn't believe this was real. My boss, one of the most successful businesswomen in Seattle, was sleeping in my bed because her life had just exploded. I thought about my own wife and how much I missed her. I thought about how unfair life could be sometimes. Eventually, I fell asleep around 4 a.m. Irene woke up at 7 o'clock the next morning like she always did. She was an early riser, just like her mother had been. When Irene saw me sleeping on her floor, she got confused. She shook my shoulder and asked me why I was there. I woke up and rubbed my eyes. I told Irene we had guests staying with us, and I gave them my room. I said she needed to be very polite and friendly because our guests were going through a hard time. Irene was a sweet kid who always wanted to help people, so she nodded seriously and promised to be good. We went out to the kitchen together. Daniel was already awake on the couch. He looked sad and confused. He was still wearing pajamas he had been wearing when Susan grabbed him from the mansion last night. Irene walked right up to him and introduced herself. She asked Daniel if he wanted to see her toy collection. Daniel looked uncertain, but Irene took his hand and led him to her room before he could say no. Susan came out of my bedroom a few minutes later. She looked exhausted. Her eyes were red and puffy from crying. She was wearing the same clothes from last night because she hadn't brought much with her when she ran out of the mansion. I started making breakfast for everyone. I scrambled some eggs, made toast, and poured orange juice for the kids. Susan sat at my small kitchen table and stared at her phone. I could hear Irene and Daniel laughing in the other room. They had bonded quickly the way kids do. Susan apologized for showing up at my door in the middle of the night. She said she didn't know what else to do. I told her she didn't need to apologize. I said anyone would have done the same thing. Susan shook her head and said that wasn't true. She said most people would turn her away or call the tabloids to make money from her story. We sat quietly eating breakfast. I asked Susan if she had a plan for what to do next. She said she needed to call her lawyer and file for divorce. She also needed to figure out where she and Daniel would live. She couldn't go back to the mansion because Scott was there. She would probably have to find an apartment. Then Susan's phone rang. It was her personal assistant, a woman named Jennifer, who had worked for Susan for 8 years. Jennifer sounded panicked on the phone. She said something was very wrong. G and Susan needed to check her bank accounts immediately. Susan put the phone on speaker, so I could hear. Jennifer explained that she had gotten a call from Susan's accountant that morning. The accountant had been doing routine checks and noticed some very large transfers had been made from Susan's personal accounts late last night. The accountant tried to call Susan, but couldn't reach her because Susan had turned off her phone while she was driving around. Susan's hand started shaking. She opened her banking app on her phone. I watched her face go completely white. Her main personal checking account showed a balance of $0. This was an account that usually had at least $50,000 in it for daily expenses. Her savings account also showed $0. That account usually had around $200,000. Susan had 3 investment accounts. She checked them one by one. All 3 were empty. Every single dollar was gone. Susan stood up so fast that her chair fell backward and hit the floor. She started breathing very hard. I thought she might faint. I ran around the table and helped her sit back down. Jennifer was still on the phone, asking if Susan was okay. Susan couldn't speak, so I took the phone and told Jennifer that Susan would call her back. I hung up. Susan finally found her voice. She told me that all her accounts had been emptied. Someone had stolen everything. When she added it up in her head, the total was over $20 million. $20 million gone in one night. I asked Susan who had access to her accounts. She said only 2 people had that kind of access. One was her accountant, a man who had worked for her family for 30 years. The other was Scott. Susan had added Scott to her accounts when they got married because she trusted him completely back then. Susan started crying. She said Scott must have done this. He had stolen all her money the same night she caught him with Michelle. This wasn't just an affair. This was planned. Scott and Michelle had probably been planning this for months. I told Susan to calm down and breathe. I said we would figure this out. Susan looked at me with tears running down her face and asked how we could fix this. Scott had probably already moved the money somewhere they couldn't track it. By tomorrow, he and Michelle would disappear and take everything Susan had worked for her whole life. That's when I told Susan I could help her. She looked confused. I explained that I wasn't just a regular computer programmer. I specialized in cybersecurity and digital forensics. I had experience tracking down hackers and finding stolen data. If Scott had moved that money digitally, he would have left a trail, and I knew how to follow it. Susan stared at me as I had just offered her a life preserver while she was drowning. She asked if I was serious. I told her I was completely serious. I said we should get started right away because the longer we waited, the harder it would be to track the money. I went to my desk and opened my laptop. Susan pulled a chair next to me. I asked her to log into her bank accounts on my computer so I could see the transaction history. The transfers had all happened between midnight and 1 in the morning, just hours after Susan caught Scott with Michelle. Someone had moved money from Susan's checking account, her savings account, and all 3 investment accounts. The money had been sent to 5 different offshore accounts in the Cayman Islands. I explained to Susan that offshore accounts in the Cayman Islands were popular for hiding money because they had strict privacy laws. But every digital transaction leaves traces. I just needed to find them. I started writing code to trace the IP address that had been used to make the transfers. It took me about an hour, but I found it. The transfers had been made from Scott's office computer in his real estate development company. Susan wasn't surprised. She said Scott had probably gone straight to his office after she ran out of the mansion. He must have spent the night moving all her money while she was driving around crying. Next, I hacked into the network of the bank in the Cayman Islands, where the money had been sent. I want to be clear that what I did was illegal, but Susan begged me to do it anyway. She said she would take full responsibility if anyone found out. It took me 3 hours to get through the bank's security systems. When I finally got in, I found the 5 accounts where Susan's money had been sent, for the accounts were empty. The money had already been moved again, but the 5th account still had $18 million in it. I did more digging and found out where the money from the other 4 accounts had been sent. It was transferred to a bank in Switzerland, then to another bank in Hong Kong, and finally to a private investment fund in Dubai. Scott was creating a complicated web to make the money impossible to trace. But he made one mistake. The account in the Cayman Islands that still had $18 million was scheduled to transfer that money at 6 o'clock that evening. Scott had set up a delayed transfer, probably because he was doing everything in a hurry and didn't have time to move all the money at once. I told Susan we had until 6 o'clock to stop that transfer. If we could freeze that account, we could save at least $18 million. The other $2 million might be gone forever, but $18 million was better than nothing. Susan asked how we could freeze the account. I told her I could do it with my code, but it would definitely be noticed by the bank and probably by the police. Susan said she didn't care. She wanted her money back. I spent the next 2 hours writing code that would lock the Cayman Islands account. It was complicated work, and I had to be very careful not to make mistakes. Susan sat next to me the whole time, watching me type and asking questions. While I worked, Susan called her lawyer. She explained everything that had happened and told the lawyer to start divorce proceedings immediately. She also told the lawyer to file a police report about the stolen money. The lawyer said he would contact the FBI because stealing $20 million and moving it offshore was a federal crime. At 3 o'clock in the afternoon, I finished my code. I ran it and watched my screen carefully. The code worked. The Cayman Islands account was now frozen. No money could be transferred in or out until the bank security team manually unlocked it. Susan hugged me. She actually hugged me right there in my living room. She said I had just saved her life. But we weren't done yet. If you're listening right now, help me prove something wrong. My dad said I wouldn't even reach 1,000 subscribers. But I believe stories like this deserve to be heard. Help me show him that these tales matter. Please subscribe to this channel, and let's keep breathing life into stories that were never meant to stay silent. Around 4 o'clock that afternoon, my phone rang. It was a number I didn't recognize. I answered it carefully. The voice on the other end was Scott. He said hello to me by name. He knew exactly who I was. That meant Susan had probably told him about me at some point during their marriage, or he had looked me up in the white limited employee directory. Scott's voice was calm and friendly. He said he understood I was helping Susan, and he respected that. Then he made me an offer. Scott said he would give me $2 million if I stopped helping Susan and deleted whatever code I had written to freeze his accounts. $2 million, transferred to any account I wanted, completely tax-free and untraceable. All I had to do was walk away and let him finish moving Susan's money. I looked across the room at Susan. She was playing with Daniel and Irene. The three of them were building something with Irene's blocks. Susan was smiling for the first time since she had shown up at my door. Daniel was laughing. I looked at my daughter. Irene was showing Daniel how to stack the blocks without letting them fall. She was being patient and kind, just like her mother had taught her to be. I thought about what $2 million could do for us. I could pay off my house. I could put Irene through any college she wanted. I could quit my job and spend more time with her. $2 million would change our lives. Then I thought about what kind of man takes money to betray someone who trusted him. I told Scott no. Scott's voice changed. He wasn't friendly anymore. He said I was making a big mistake. He said I had no idea who I was messing with. He said he had lawyers and connections, and he would destroy me if I got in his way. I told Scott I had already frozen his Cayman Islands account. I told him the FBI was already involved, and they were tracking the rest of Susan's money. I told him he should turn himself in before things got worse. Scott laughed. He said I was bluffing. He said there was no way I could have frozen his account. Then he hung up. 10 minutes later, my phone rang again. This time it was a different number. I answered it. It was Michelle, Susan's sister. Michelle's voice was nasty and mean. She called Susan terrible names. She said Susan had always been a cold workaholic who didn't deserve a good husband like Scott. She said I was an idiot for helping Susan instead of taking Scott's money. Then Michelle said something that made my blood run cold. She said she knew where I lived. She said she knew I had a daughter. She said I should think very carefully about what might happen to Irene if I kept interfering. I hung up on her immediately. I went to Susan and told her what Michelle had said. Susan's face went pale. She said we needed to call the police right away. I called the Oakwood Police Department. I explained that someone had threatened my daughter. The officer I spoke to said he would send a patrol car to my street. He also said I should keep my doors locked and not let Irene out of my sight. For the rest of the afternoon, a police car sat outside my house. The officer inside kept watch to make sure nobody suspicious came near us. Meanwhile, Susan's lawyer called back. He said the FBI had agreed to take the case. 2 agents were being assigned to investigate the theft. They wanted to meet with Susan the next morning. I kept working on my computer. I was trying to trace the $2 million that had already been moved to Switzerland, Hong Kong, and Dubai. It was much harder than freezing the Cayman Islands account because those banks had better security systems. Around 7 o'clock that evening, I found something interesting. The money in Dubai had been used to purchase a pair of first-class plane tickets. The tickets were for a flight leaving Seattle tomorrow at noon. The destination was Rio de Janeiro, Brazil. Brazil didn't have an extradition treaty with the United States for financial crimes. If Scott and Michelle got on that plane and made it Brazil, they could live there freely, and the American government couldn't force them to come back. I showed Susan what I had found. She immediately called her lawyer again. The lawyer said he would contact the FBI agents and tell them about the plane tickets. Within an hour, the FBI called Susan directly. They said they were getting a warrant for Scott's arrest. They were also getting a warrant to search his office and his house. They planned to arrest him first thing in the morning, before he could get to the airport. Susan cried again, but this time they were tears of relief. She said she couldn't believe this was actually working. She said she couldn't believe I had done all this for her. I told Susan she didn't need to thank me. I said anyone in my position would have done the same thing. Susan shook her head. She said that wasn't true. She said most people would have taken Scott's bribe or just stayed out of the whole mess. That night, we ordered pizza for dinner. Irene and Daniel were thrilled because I usually didn't let Irene have pizza on a weeknight. The 4 of us sat around my kitchen table, eating pizza and drinking soda. For a little while, it almost felt normal. After dinner, Susan put Daniel to bed on the couch again. Irene went to her room. Susan and I stayed up talking. She told me more about her life and her marriage. She said she had ignored the warning signs that something was wrong. She had been too focused on growing her company. She felt guilty about that. I told Susan she shouldn't blame herself. I said Scott was the one who chose to have an affair and steal her money. Those were his choices, not hers. We talked until midnight. Then Susan said she should try to get some sleep because tomorrow was going to be a difficult day. She went to my bedroom, and I went to sleep on Irene's floor again. The next morning, everything happened very fast. At 8 o'clock, 2 FBI agents came to my house. They needed to interview Susan about the stolen money. Susan told them everything while I made coffee. The agents took notes and asked detailed questions. They said they had enough evidence to arrest Scott and charge him with wire fraud, theft, and money laundering. At 9 o'clock, the agents got a call. Scott had been arrested at his mansion. Michelle had been arrested at her apartment. Both of them were being taken to the federal courthouse in Seattle. Susan closed her eyes and took a deep breath. It was over. They had been caught. The FBI agents told Susan she would need to come to Seattle to make an official statement. They also said the $18 million in the frozen Cayman Islands account would be returned to her, but it might take a few weeks because there was paperwork involved. The other $2 million would be harder to recover, but they would try. After the agents left, Susan sat on my couch and didn't say anything for a long time. Daniel and Irene were in the other room playing again. They had become best friends in just 2 days. Finally, Susan looked at me. She said she needed to give me something to thank me for everything I had done. She took out her phone and opened her banking app. She said she wanted to transfer $5 million to my account as a reward. $5 million. I couldn't even imagine that much money. Susan was serious. She said I had saved her company and her future. I had protected her son. I had given her a safe place to stay when she had nowhere to go. $5 million was the least she could do. I thought about what $5 million would mean. Irene could go to any school she wanted. I could stop working and spend every day with her. We could travel. We could move to a bigger house. We would never have to worry about money again. But then I thought about why I had helped Susan in the first place. It wasn't because I wanted money. It was because she needed help and I was able to give it. It was because she trusted me when she had nobody else to trust. It was because helping people was the right thing to do. My wife had always taught me that doing the right thing was its own reward. She said the best way to live was to help others without expecting anything in return. I had tried to live by that rule since she died. I told Susan I couldn't take her money. Susan looked shocked. She said I had to take it. She said I deserved it. She said $5 million was nothing compared to what I had done for her. I shook my head. I told Susan that having a friend like her was worth more than any amount of money. I said, knowing that I had helped her and that Daniel was all the reward I needed. I said I was just happy they were safe. Susan started crying again. She said nobody had ever turned down that much money before. She said I was the most genuine person she had ever met. She said she was lucky to have me as a friend. I told Susan she could do something else for me instead of giving me money. I said she could stay in touch with Irene. I said our kids clearly loved playing together, and it would be nice if they could keep being friends. Susan smiled through her tears. She said she would like that very much. She said Daniel needed a friend like Irene, especially after everything that had happened. Over the next few days, Susan found an apartment in Seattle. It wasn't as big as her mansion, but it was nice and safe. She moved in with Daniel and started putting her life back together. Scott and Michelle went to trial 6 months later. They were both found guilty. Scott was sentenced to 15 years in federal prison for financial crimes. Michelle was sentenced to 10 years as an accomplice. The FBI managed to recover another $1 million of Susan's money from the accounts in Switzerland and Hong Kong. The last $1 million was never found, but Susan said she didn't care. She had her company, her son, and her freedom. That was enough. Susan and I stayed friends. She came to visit Irene and me in Oakwood at least once a month. Daniel and Irene had playdates every weekend. Sometimes Susan brought dinner. Sometimes I cooked. We talked about work, life, and raising kids alone. It was nice to have someone who understood. One day, about a year after that night, Susan knocked on my door, and she told me something that surprised me. She said that night had changed her whole perspective on life. She had been so focused on money and success that she forgot what really mattered. Now she made sure to spend more time with Daniel. She promoted people at her company based on character, not just results. She donated more money to charity. She said I had taught her that being a good person was more important than being a rich person. I told Susan she had taught me something, too. She had taught me that I didn't have to be alone. For 3 years after my wife died, I had kept everyone at a distance because I was afraid of being hurt again. But helping Susan and becoming her friend had reminded me that life was better when you let people in. Susan smiled and said we had helped each other then. I agreed. That night, after Susan and Daniel went home, Irene asked me if Susan was going to be her friend forever. I said I thought so. Irene said she was happy because she really liked Danny, and she really liked Susan too. I tucked Irene into bed and kissed her goodnight. As I turned off her light, I thought about everything that had happened. One knock on my door at 2 a.m. had changed my whole life. It had brought me a true friend and taught me that I was stronger than I thought. This story teaches us that true wealth isn't measured in money, but in character, trust, and genuine human connection. Joshua had every reason to turn away a stranger at 2 a.m., but he chose compassion over convenience. When offered $2 million to betray Susan's trust and later $5 million as a reward, he refused both because he understood that integrity and friendship are priceless. The story shows that helping others without expecting anything in return brings the deepest fulfillment, and that doing the right thing, even when it's difficult or dangerous, defines who we truly are. Susan learned that success means nothing without people who genuinely care about you, while Joshua discovered that opening your heart to others after loss can lead to meaningful relationships that enrich your life far more than any bank account ever could. In the end, both characters found that real security comes not from money or status, but from being the kind of person others can trust when their world falls apart. So here's the real question. Did you subscribe yet? Thousands of people will listen to this story and won't subscribe. Please don't be that person. If you're listening right now, help me prove something wrong. My dad said I wouldn't even reach 1,000 subscribers, but I believe stories like this deserve to be heard. Help me show him that these tales matter. Please subscribe to this channel, and let's keep breathing life into stories that were never meant to stay silent. And here's what I need to know. Do you want part 2?